Hey, welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways, Coyote in the Highlands. We're going to do another one. This one might run a little bit longer also. I'm having a couple videos that run longer, a couple videos that run shorter. I'm trying to do the multiple 6 to 7 minute videos every day. Sometimes they just run a little longer because the topic's a little bigger. I want to talk about industrial agriculture just a little bit because it's a concept that people think of as this big mass thing, and no one really thinks about the history. You know, people say, oh, we've had industrial agriculture for 140 years or 200 years, or it's been this thing. And it's like, well, not really. You know, people, when they don't think about it, when they're not thinking, they think about tractors as industrial agriculture. Okay, the Ford 8N tractor. I've had one. I've had a Ford 9 tractor too, which is Ford 9 actually came out before the Ford 8N. The Ford 9 is the older 1930s, and in the 1940s you've got the Ford 8N. These are older tractors. These are little tractors. They had, 20 horsepower, 30 horsepower tractors. They're made for plowing and doing stuff, and you can put attachments on them. You can harvest with them, and there's all sorts of stuff you can do. Most people nowadays call them chore tractors because they're small. People ran entire farms off of these things, and they're great. They're wonderful, you know. And in the teens and the 20s, 19-teens, 1920s, as people were developing tractors, this was what you did. That's mechanized agriculture. It's not industrial agriculture. Get that through your head right away. The fact that you have a tractor does not mean it's industrial. It just means it's mechanized. You have a work aid. You have basically what amounts to a mechanical team of 20 mules or horses that is small, and you don't have to feed. It's really super convenient because livestock are kind of hard to care for, and especially when you're talking about mules and horses and their less efficient digestive systems and all of that, there's a lot of care that goes into that. So mechanized agriculture is not the same thing as industrial agriculture. Having a tractor is not industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture really took off post-World War II. Now, we had the beginnings. We had some of the trends and tendencies going on in the teens and the 20s, even as far back as the 1880s. And this is industrial food, okay? This is the idea of food factories, all right? The first ones were actually the big slaughterhouses, the really big slaughterhouses, where we centralized the slaughterhouses instead of having them be just local and everything. The big cattle drives in Chicago and all of that. That should have been a big warning sign right away that you're taking your food away from your local stuff. But we had progressivism at that time. That was the late 19th century, early 20th century. And progressivism is the scientific, elitist, utopian, industrial, utilitarian centralization of efficiency of everything, right? Oh, yeah. So that's hilarious. But so we had the antecedents coming in, but we didn't really get there until post-World War II. And the main points are we industrialized fertilizer. Soil management became an industrial process, okay? Not a natural process, but an industrial process. Quite often, most of your fertilization was not from running herds of animals over your fields in the winter, cleaning up the stubble and burning the wheat and doing all this stuff, but adding chemical fertilizers, mass-produced fertilizers from plants. You know, that includes carting, like carting the pig waste from pig farms over. You know, we got large-scale pig farms. All this stuff is post-World War II. Really took off. A lot of it was invented earlier. I'm not saying it wasn't invented earlier, but this is industrial agriculture. Okay, this is where it comes in. We also changed the crops, so we industrialized soil management. We centralized, made these factory-produced fertilizers, all this stuff. We also started changing the crops. We started changing the crops in a huge way. Wheat is the best example, but there's also sorghum and soy and corn. Corn was a bigger one, but came a little after wheat, really, in the major trends, and stuff like rapeseed oil, or rapeseed, the plant, which is canola, because Canada wanted a fun name for their new rapeseed. because rapeseed sounds kind of bad, right? Like, but it's high in uric acid, so it makes it an unpalatable seed oil, and then they bred it, selectively bred it. These are industrial crops, okay? Wheat's the best example because what wheat did was we took wheat and we increased the size of the outer part, not the wheat germ, but the rest of it, the actual carbohydrate part, basically, of this of the wheat berry, the seed, by a factor of 10, like woof, 900%, right? So you completely unbalanced the whole health aspect of it, but it also made these big, huge wheat berries that you could put into food factories. We'll get to that in a moment. And so we actually wheat used to be taller than you, taller than me, but we had to, everything is now dwarf wheat because the tall stalks weren't strong enough for the newer, bigger wheat berries. So we bred industrial crops, okay? And we bred those industrial crops for a very specific reason, and that was to feed food factories. This is the other part of industrial agriculture, which started earlier, as I mentioned with Chicago and the slaughterhouses. Started a little bit earlier, but it really took off after World War II. The idea of food factories. You make your food in a factory. You don't get it off the farm and eat it. It's not farm to table. The cheeseburger one, I'll do a cheeseburger video in a moment, is a really good example of all the little things that changed. So food factories, and that was a big one, and that we went through that with the whole, we went through that with the 20s and 30s some, but with the 40s, late 40s, 50s, 60s, we went through this whole idea of food factories. We now have factories that take raw agricultural industrial products, the sorghum, the wheat, the corn, and they make food-like substances out of it, okay? In fact, they breed all of the stuff to be longer lasting in silos and stuff so that they can use it as feedstock for an industrial process in the factory to make food-like substances, okay? All of your boxed and bagged cereals, grain products, all of that stuff, all the seed oils, it's all factory-produced food-like substances that comes from raw materials that is industrial agriculture. It's not food that you eat, okay? Even like classic wheat, you would at least grind it up at home. Like people used to grind wheat at home. It's not that big a deal. Little tabletop grinders and mortars and pestles and this stuff, it was not. I used to do it. I went to the hospital several times every year. I was doing ER about once a month at one point, just because I actually do not react well to wheat at all. But I used to be a baker, and it was very bad for me. It was very bad for my lungs. But I used to grind my own wheat berries and stuff because I couldn't get really fresh flour and all of that. It's not that big a deal. People used to do it. Industrial food factories. That's a big part of industrial agriculture, and that's mostly post-World War II, as is refrigerated transport. That's another big one that's industrial agriculture. Instead of a patch of lettuce, people used to have truck gardens or market gardens. And I don't mean one or two people, I mean lots of people, okay? Farms had lots of truck and market gardens where you would do the actual produce that would go to your local market. Major refrigerated transport. Remember the Grapes of Wrath? Remember that whole book? Did you ever read that? See the movie? Okay, refrigerated transport was a big deal, and it didn't take off. We didn't really have the technology for it until after World War II. And that's a really big deal, and that's one of the things that produced industrial agriculture, because now you can take your foodstuffs that are going to perish, really perishable stuff, the lettuces and things, and you can refrigerate the transport and just transport them everywhere. So the lettuces that you get in Maine is grown in Mexico. The lettuce you get in Maine is grown in Mexico on industrial plants. Realize that a lot of the foodborne illnesses, the salmonella, the E. coli, most of that stuff isn't actually a meat problem. It's mostly vegetables, and it's mostly from the work environment of growing and harvesting those vegetables on an industrial scale. That's where we get that from. Just like we never had pandemic diseases until we invented cities because of agriculture and all that. I've gone through that. Industrial agriculture, industrial vegetable production, which relies on refrigerated transport, that was a big thing. Now, of course, we've bred industrial species of plants so that we can transport them better. Like oranges come from South America on ships. You know, tomatoes, we bred tomatoes until they're not even tasty anymore. They're just these hard, pinkish, tasteless, flavorless packages that have been bred so that you can stack them in railroad cars or trucks and drive them across the country without refrigeration. So there's modifications to the plants themselves, but it was refrigerated transport that really got the ball rolling. And that is industrial agriculture in a very, very basic nutshell. Industrial agriculture is a set of practices, refrigerated transport and industrial soil management, and changing the product of the farms to be feedstock for industrial factory food like substance production, food factories. You know, these are big things. And of course the machinery got bigger, and the fuel got cheaper, and the technology got better, and that's all part of the industrialization process. But these are the things that made industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture really, if you want to talk about really taking off, is more like 80 years old than it is 140 years old. Maybe 75. You know, I can make an argument that it's actually not really more than 65 years old as I record this, because there's levels of this, right? But really, let's just call it the late 40s, early 50s. That's industrial agriculture, not mechanized agriculture, you know. Malthus was completely wrong because he didn't understand the greening of the earth and how raising CO2 increases plant survivability and plant growth rates and all of that. But he also didn't understand industrialization processes and mechanization processes. So he was wrong, Malthus. I don't know if I said Malthus at first or Maslow. I've been thinking about Maslow a lot. But Malthus was wrong because his idea of agriculture for his population bomb doom scenarios his idea of agriculture itself was wrong. Mechanization was a really big deal and continues to be a really big deal because the world isn't fully mechanized. But mechanization is not industrialization. Industrial agriculture, post-war agriculture, is a really big deal and something to look at. If you want to examine it and take it apart and try to fix it, you need to know what it is. And that is what it is. Stay sideways.